I am going to talk about the formation of the cluster, step-by-step process. In the architecture itself, you may have got an visualization on how this is going to go. Okay, and we are going to now see it in step-by-step way. Okay, so that it will be a bit useful for you to in order to recollect and all that. So knowing the step-by-step process, listen carefully. I'm going to summarize what we have seen in the architecture here. So we're going to see the step-by-step procedural way of cluster formation. Okay. So how do we start with Docker engine? Like to put it like a box. Docker engine. Okay. So what is the next step? We have Docker CRI installation. So what is the other step? We have a system tuning step and all. So that's why I put this diagram. And then we have another step, which is the installation of Kubernetes packages. Okay. And then we have the other step, which is the cluster initialization of the bootstrapping. And then we have the other step, which is called as configuring the cluster, configuring the Kubernetes client to communicate the cluster. And then we are going to talk about integrate a network driver called CNI, Flannel plugin, and finally join all the nodes to the cluster. So totally, I believe there will be 8 steps. Okay. So we always basically start with the Docker engine. Okay. The Docker engine is the first step we always start, the Docker engine part. Okay. So basically what we do here is we install and configure. Okay, configure Docker engine setup. Okay, so like how we did in the Docker, we do it like this. And then we have the next step, which is the Docker CRI part. This is also something which we need to know, as it's an coupling between the kubelet and the container engine, that is the Docker engine. So you see, this CRI is a product of an enterprise Docker. Okay, so there is something called as a Docker enterprise. Okay, so there is something called as Docker EE. It's called, formerly it was called EE. Now it is called as Mirantis. So this Docker CRI is from the company called Mirantis. It's an enterprise Docker. Okay, so earlier Docker managed the Docker EE and the Docker Community Edition, that is the Docker CE. Now the Docker EE is formerly the Docker EE. Now it is the Mirantis. So Mirantis actually provided the CRI interface for Docker with the Kubernetes. So it's a very trusted one. So it's from the official Docker only. Okay. And then we need to install and configure. So what basically we need to do here is install and configure Docker CRI. Install and configure the Docker CRI. Okay. And then we have the next step. We need to customize the system. Okay, customize the system in the sense, tune the system. Okay. We need to do some system tuning. We need to do some system tuning, basically Linux tuning, slight Linux tuning, not great things. Okay, system tuning. So what I mean here is, I mean that we need to disable the system swap. Disable swap in system. Disable swap memory. Okay, and then we need to patch the kernel, Linux kernel with few configurations, which means just updating few kernel configs. Patch the kernel with modify few kernel params like this. Okay, and then you have the third part, which is we have there is something called a secure Linux in Linux world. It's called SE Linux. We need to disable or make it permissive. Okay, so disable SE Linux. Okay, SE Linux means it is called as secure Linux. Okay, we need to disable that. By default, it will be enabled, which will be a problem for Kubernetes to manipulate the IP table. So why we do this SE Linux? This thing is because Kubernetes manipulates the IP tables. Okay, so because Kubernetes manipulates the IP tables. That is why we need to disable this. So this is a reason for that. And the next step is we need to install Kubernetes components. So what we do in the Kubernetes is in this step is we install Kubernetes packages. Basically, like so what do we do here is we install and configure Kubernetes tools. So what are all the tools we are going to install and configure here? There are three things which we actually configure or use. Okay, here that is we have something called as kubeadmin, kubeadmin, KDM, and then you have a program or that is also part of a kubeadm package, and then you have a program called kubectl. So that is the Kubernetes client, which is an essential thing to talk to the API server. And what is that? We have kubelet, which is the agent. Okay, kubelet, which is the agent, Kubernetes agent. So what's the main purpose of all these tools is this kubeadm is responsible for cluster bootstrap. This is used for cluster bootstrapping and node management. Okay, which means you can join a worker node with the master and all that. And the kubelet, you know already. So it's the Kubernetes client. Kubernetes client, and you have the kubelet, which is the Kubernetes agent. So these three are very famous ingredients or important tools which is required for production grade cluster building. Now, I'll tell one important thing. If you go to the Kubernetes documentation, there is a way you can use Kubernetes in development using Minikube kind of tools and all that. That and all is not useful or worthy for production grade building. Okay, so if you want production grade building of the cluster and that level you want to think means, because as a DevOps engineer we need to think at that level. So then we have to talk this. You need to use these tools. Okay, for production grade cluster building, this is all the tools we need. And then after this, we have to initialize the cluster. So cluster init cluster, or let's say trap cluster, and then you have to configure Kubernetes client to operate the control plane. Configure the Kubernetes client, and then integration with the Flannel network. Okay, so integrate CNI. Okay, and then finally join nodes to cluster. Okay, so in the bootstrapping cluster part, we have the bootstrapping cluster. We call it as initialization part, but I want to say the bootstrapping, it's a 7-step process actually. Okay, it has lots of phases, so it's a 7-step process now also. So 7-step process. Okay, so this bootstrapping cluster actually creates the cluster metadata. Creates cluster metadata or cluster state. We call this cluster state as, you need to remember that word, this is the brain of the cluster. Okay, brain of the cluster. It's a 7-step process, and configuring the Kubernetes client is to operate the so this helps you to operate the Kubernetes master node or the control, or otherwise control plane. Okay, and then you have the CNI. So CNI is an integrates Kubernetes with network drivers. Okay, so what are all the famous CNI using CNI? CNI is a separate project in the CNCF community. Okay, using the CNI. So what are all the drivers? So in the Docker, you may have seen Docker CNM. So in the Kubernetes, it is not CNM; it is Container Networking Interface (CNI). Okay, so here we have. So it helps you to integrate with different things like there are Calico, Cilium, and you have Flannel. Flannel is the one which is supported on cloud as well as on premises. So that's why mostly we trust Flannel. And there is, I think, something called as Rancher or something. I don't know. So these are all mostly supported. I think in the book also there are a couple of names there. So supported networking drivers specifically for containers. Okay. So this is specifically built for all these things are specifically built for containers. So that we need to mention here. So specifically for containers. These are all famous drivers, but Kubernetes CNI customizes it in such a way it is suited for container infrastructure. Okay, specifically for containers. And then finally, joining the node with the cluster, joining the master nodes, worker nodes, all these things you can do with this. So we have a program called, so how do you do this means you have a program called joining the worker nodes. So worker nodes means all the worker nodes, which it could be 110 or 20, 30, anything like that. So the program which we used to do this is we use the Kubeadm program. This program. So this helps you to join the other worker. So that is how you can see this step. So we have discussed now this. I do not know how many steps here. We need to count it. So this is how you exactly form a Kubernetes cluster, and it's like just a vanilla cluster, so nothing running in it. So it is composed of this much amount of steps. In each steps, we do something. Okay. So I believe now I think I have done all the points very clearly.